Well, welcome everyone to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on biblical manhood and womanhood, dealing with head coverings, prophecies, and the Trinity as found in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 6. And I'd like to go ahead and start by reading these verses in full. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 26. Now I praise you because you always remember me and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. So if a woman's head is not covered, her hair should be cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, she should be covered. A man, in fact, should not cover his head because he is God's image and glory, but woman is man's glory. For man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. And man was not created for woman, but woman for man. This is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as a woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For her hair is given to her as a covering. But if anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. Now in giving the following instruction, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For to begin with, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. There must, indeed, be factions among you, so that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper, for at the meal, each one eats his own supper ahead of the others. So one person is hungry while another gets drunk. Don't you have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you look down on the church of God and embarrass those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I praise you? I did not praise you for this. For what I received from the Lord, and what I also passed on to you. On the night when he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he also took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant established in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." All right, so there's the verses in full. So let's now kind of jump into asking ourselves, what are some of the questions we're going to have to deal with? Well, the first one is we're going to have to answer, how does verse 2 relate to the rest of it? Okay, that's one question. How does verse 2 relate to the rest of it? And that is, now I praise you because you always remember me and keep the traditions just as I delivered. So is this a tradition? Is he delivered? What's going on here? We're going to try and answer that. What is again meant by head in verse 3? Some would say the head is the physical head. Some would say the head is the authority. There's a lot of different things. Some say it's a symbol. Third, we're going to want to know, what is the custom of adornment in women contextually? Fourth, in what sense is woman the glory of man? That's a legitimate question to ask. Fifth, woman is to have authority on her head. What does that mean? There's also the angel reference in verse 10, which is kind of an interesting one. And then what is the nature in verse 14, okay, that we're looking at. So even though we might have some confusion on some of these issues in the verse, there is a clear central thrust. And there is an abiding principle for the 21st century, for modern day. And so we're going to get to that as we move through. So first, let's take a look at this idea of the relationship of 11:2 to the rest of it, 11:3 through 16. And I know I read a little bit more there, but I'm really going to focus on 3 through 16. The traditions that Paul delivered do not seem to be held by the Corinthians. Okay, so this is the first issue. They aren't held by the Corinthians in the case of women. Okay, now, it simply functions to complement the Corinthians on what they're doing right. So what are they doing right? He's like, well, he says it. I praise you because you remember and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. Okay, so great. Okay, they keep the traditions. But the traditions about Paul and the women are not being kept. So what are they not doing right? Well, they're not keeping the traditions regarding women correctly. They're not keeping the Lord's Supper, and as we'll learn, they're also not keeping the traditions of spiritual gifts correctly. These are all in the context of this chapter. Okay, so what's the adornment then for women in this passage? Well, there's a couple possibilities. First, it could be that Paul recommends women wear shawls. In other words, kind of keep your head covered and your hair wrapped. Okay. Paul then, in this case, would object to long, loose hair that falls down and behind the back, and he wants women to follow the usual custom of piling up the hair on top of their heads. It's possible. The other possibility is that it's a veil. Okay. However, that's less likely. The shawl is absolutely most likely. The verb translated as a cover or kataklipto most often refers to a covering of some kind or to hide something. Philo, writing between 30 BC and 45 AD, used the same words as Paul had uncovered, a kataklipto te kephale. It's clear again in Philo's writing that it's referring to a head covering, and this is also similar in Polybius. Esther 6:12 in the Septuagint, again that's the Greek translation, uses the same expression to refer to head covering in the shame of Haman, kata kephales. Okay, probably hide one's head. He probably used a garment to then do this. And Plutarch, writing between 46 and 120 AD, said the head is covered with a part of a toga. So this is commonly used in terms of a head covering of some kind, not a face veil, but a head covering or a shawl. Okay. Now, we see that in verse 15, it talks about the hair is given for a covering. Okay. Now, this is interesting. And it's, if we take a look at this in verse 15, again, we're just taking a look at some of these words and things like that, and you're trying to make sure we get an understanding of this. In verse 15, but if a woman has long hair, it's her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering. Okay? So that's a type of covering. And it's probably not being used for a substitution for head covering here, but an equivalence. Paul's not saying that women have been given long hair instead of a covering. Rather, he's saying again that women have been given long hair as a covering. But the point is, again, that a woman's long hair is an indication that she needs to wear a covering of some kind. Now, that's the basics about this whole head covering and the type of adornment, a shawl of some kind. So let's move on to 11.3. The function of 11.3 in the argument and the meaning of head. So there's two possible answers for the definition of the word head, this case in verse 3. But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man. So we're not talking about a physical head here. That's very clear. Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. So what are our possibilities? What could this possibly mean? Well, it could either mean source. So in other words, if it does mean source, it would read something like this. I want you to know that Christ is the source of every man, and the man is the source of the woman, and God is the source of Christ. Okay, that's odd right off the bat for a number of reasons. We'll get into it. The other possibility is authority, which actually fits really well with the passage. But I want you to know that Christ is the authority of every man, and man is the authority of the woman, and God is the authority of Christ. That fits perfectly. Source, not really. So let's talk about this. There are three reasons to defend authority as the understanding of head in this case. So again, authority, that definition, is indisputable in a number of passages, while using head as source is never certainly attested. Okay? So in other words, we've got a lot more backing in terms of the scripture, in terms of it being authority. Even if the head does mean source in a few passages, it never bears that meaning in the Septuagint, and that is the relevant piece of literature with which Paul would have been most familiar. So again, from the backgrounds, we're seeing that, yeah, this looks like it's going to be authority. That's how it's used in the Old Testament. That's what Paul would have been used to. Now, how does Paul use this in other writings? In Ephesians 5:22, Paul is talking about the head of the wife. This has got to be authority. Ephesians 1:20 gave him as head over all things to the church. This is in reference to exaltation and enthronement of Christ. It's very much authority. Colossians 2:10, the head over every power and authority, must mean authority, as 2:15 again is referring to demonic powers. Jesus can't be the source of demonic powers. He's got to be the authority over these powers. Okay. However, there are also some texts used to argue source. This would be Colossians 1:18, Colossians 2:19, and Ephesians 4:15. We'll just take a look at one of those here, so you can see what that might look like. Colossians 1:18. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. So again, some would say, well, he is the head of the body. He's the source of the body of the church. He's the authority of the body of the church. Again, inconclusive. Could be source, but inconclusive. Okay? Again, in each of these cases, the meaning is actually doubtful. It's almost always authority. Now, what about 1 Corinthians 11:3 then? So Paul is saying, essentially, that Christ is the authority over every man, the man is the authority over woman, and that God is the authority over Christ. And he's going to appeal, again, to these relationships of members of the Trinity. So this is interesting. This idea that, well, man is not really the authority over woman anymore because that was a part of the fall or something like that, and it's been redeemed, so there's no more authority. Well, he's literally saying Christ is the authority over every man, so that's clearly not fall-related. That's just permanent. And then God is the authority over Christ. That's not fall-affected. So the idea that man is the authority over woman, I mean, it follows that, and especially being sandwiched between those two, it follows that that still plays through to today, that is actually an aspect of creation. That's something God designed from the very beginning. Again, Christ designed from the very beginning. He'd be the authority over every man, and God is the authority over Christ. So again, it's going to be very hard to argue that this is a fall issue, a fall of man issue that is redeemed. No. It seems that no, man is the authority over woman in general. We have some people like Kruger that makes Christ subordinate to God. So he would argue, see, this makes Christ subordinate to God, like God's authority over Christ. But here's the problem. Subordination theory, where you say that Christ is inferior or subordinate to God, when people try to go there, they're often trying to refer to an ontological subordination. In other words, they're talking about a subordination in nature and being. And that's not the case. Jesus is only subordinate in the sense that he willingly submitted to the Father's authority. This is a functional issue, not an essential or essence level, being level issue. Okay, this is also, by the way, confirmed by 1 Corinthians 15:28, which we'll go ahead and take a look at now. And when everything is subject to Christ, then the Son himself will also be subject to the one who subjected everything to him, so that God may be all in all. And so here again we have this authority being given between Christ and God. Pretty cool stuff. All right. So feminists, however, see difference in function as difference in essence. And this really is the problem. The fundamental core of feminism is this idea that if you have a different role, you have a different worth, a different integrity, a different value. And that is dangerous, dangerous, dangerous thinking. That can be applied to anything. That can be applied to skin color. That can be applied to men and women. That could be applied to really anything. The idea that simply because one is somehow different than others, that one has different value and dignity. And the problem is that's fundamentally an antichrist or satanic thought. Why? Because God has said that all human beings have the same inherent value, worth, and dignity because they are members of, or they have, as part of their creation, they are made in the image of God. And so what we have here is a problem where people are not recognizing the difference between role and function and inherent value and worth. Men and women have the same inherent value and worth, but they have different roles and functions. Okay? Women can have babies, men cannot have babies. Subordinationism, again, then, is redefined to include role, and it should not include that. Again, role is submission, not subordination. Subordination, or suborder, if you will, or an ordinal, that actually it talks about essence level differences. And that's not what we're getting at here. We're talking about submission, that is authority level differences. And you have to make a distinction between essence and role, or you literally lose the Trinity. If, for example, there are fundamentally differences at the essence level between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, then you have three different gods. So you've got to make this distinction. So men and women are equal in terms of their image-bearing natures, and they are different regarding their roles and functions. Now, we also see, for example, the examples of the Father sending the Son. There's a submission there. The sending of the Holy Spirit. There's a submission there. Only doing what the Father does. There's a submission there. And obedience unto death by Jesus. Another submission. Okay? Another argument, though, that they use for source is from 11:8, which references that women came from man. And this is to demonstrate that woman is the glory of man, not anything to do with head or covering. So the issue here is when they're talking about source in verse 11 and 8, that the woman came from man, yeah, there is source there. The man did come from woman. Yeah, we get that. But again, that's talking about the woman's glory, not head covering or authority or anything like that. Okay. So, We now have this other interesting question of the order in verse 11:3. Paul does not write that the head of Christ is God, the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man. That would be very much a hierarchical order. Paul instead places the head of Christ as God last. And I think the reason that he wants to do this is because he wants to assert that the authority of man over woman does not imply the inferiority of woman or the superiority of man. It just doesn't. It's simply a role. Christ is not inferior, thus women are not inferior. That's essentially the argument that Paul's making. Now, what about the relationship of 11:4 through 6-3? So he gets in this interesting kind of comment that no man should wear a head covering while praying and prophesying, and a woman should show the authority outlined in the previous verse. So the problem here is that a man should not shamefully depict himself as a woman. And women should not shamefully depict themselves as men. So again, the failure of a woman to show proper authority and deference is also a problem. And what is this failure like? Well, it's like having your hair cut or shaved, cut short or shaved, like a man. Okay? The misuse of head covering, similar like the misuse of haircuts, the misuse of any cultural signifier that distinguishes men and women, would confuse the sexes and give a shameful impression, again, that women are behaving like men. So what is this idea of dishonoring the head? One dishonors one's own head. That's the self. The word head can refer to oneself, as in Acts 18:6. And again, there's a parallel in verses 14 and 15 here where head means oneself. So that's another option for the head to mean. Verses 4 through 6, there's a very close relationship between one's physical head and the disgracing of one's head. Okay? Now, the problem is what are we disgracing? Well, we're dishonoring the one with authority over oneself. Again, head is a metaphorical link here, which is linking again to verse 3. And both the head in terms of Christ and the man could be in sight here, but they're not mutually exclusive. So failing to wear a head covering communicated rebellion and independence to everyone present in that worship congregation. And so it's also interesting to note, though, that Paul permits women to pray and prophesy in public assembly. That's fascinating. We'll get to that in 2 weeks from now when we talk about the women should be silent in churches. It's actually relating to the prophetic gift in a way, and we'll talk about that. And so again, the context favors the idea that these chapters describe public worship and that prophecy was given to the community to edify the community when gathered. It's not a private gift. And even if the meetings were in a home, for example, such meetings would have been considered public assemblies. So 1 Corinthians 14:33b-36 is not going to forbid all speaking by women in public, but only speaking in the course of their congregation's judging of prophecies, which is what I'm going to argue in 2 weeks from now. And this is why this is linked to this verse, which supports male headship. So the problem is anything, Paul's going to basically argue that anything that goes against male headship in the church is fundamentally against God. And we need to be very clear about this because it's very common in theological circles. And this is where it gets really hard, by the way. It's very common in theological circles because large groups of Christians have differing views and differing opinions and differing interpretations, to say that, oh, it's all acceptable. Oh, it's all fine. Right? That's just another view. That's just a view. Complementarianism is just a view. Arminianism is just a view. Calvinism is just a view. Egalitarianism is just a view. They're just different views, and different churches have different views on these things, and that's all well and good. So we have to make a distinction because I don't actually agree with that sentiment at all. I think there's two things we have to distinguish between. The first one is this. What is the difference between orthodox and unorthodox? Orthodox means it does not impugn upon or affect any of the central doctrines of Christianity. It means that you can believe this and still fundamentally be a Christian. In other words, things like the resurrection. If you deny the resurrection, you're not a Christian. If you deny that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you're not a Christian. If you deny the divinity and humanity of Christ, you're not a Christian. If you deny salvation by grace through faith, you're not a Christian. So, right, there's these core things that we would call orthodox. In the Protestant faith, we would call these orthodox. These are things you have to believe in order to be saved. Now, the problem then is this. The problem is that orthodox and unorthodox is not the same as right and wrong, or more correct or less correct. And so I would argue that the complementarian position is the correct position, that the egalitarian position is not the correct position. And I would say that that is actually a heresy of some kind, but I would say that it is an orthodox heresy and that it does not actually affect one's salvation. So it's still within the realm of orthodoxy, even though I think it is fundamentally incorrect and a non-biblical teaching. So these are the types of things that we have to contend with. We have to be able to disagree with each other and also recognize whether something's orthodox or not, whether something's allowed within the body or not. And that would be something that's allowed, even though I think it is wrong. And so, again, we have to get to that point, though, because it's not just, oh, whatever you believe is fine. That is also very incorrect. It's not believe whatever you want. What we're going for here is right belief. Okay? Now, how about the function of 7 through 10, this argument? So, taking a look back at 7 through 10, Seven through 10 is a man, in fact, should not cover his head because he is God's image and glory, but a woman's man's glory. For a man did not come from woman, but a woman came from man, and man was not created for woman, but woman for man. This is why a woman should have the symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. All right, so let's go ahead and deal with some of this. So, first off, this idea that man should not do these things. Well, he's the image and glory of God, and women should wear head coverings and things. She's the glory of man. So women are the glory of man. What does that mean? Okay. Women came from man in the creation order. She should honor or glory him in respect for the simple fact that's where she came from. Similarly, by the way, people are to honor and love God simply for the fact that he created us. Okay. Women honors man how? By wearing a head covering, showing that the man is the head or the authority. Again, man was not created because of woman, but woman was created of man. She was created to accompany and be a helper. It follows then that the woman should honor man. And remember, accompanying and being a helper does not mean, it's again not inferiority. It's God gave man a task that man was incapable of completing. And so God created woman to assist in man completing the task. So that task functionally becomes a task of both of them now, even though it was given to man first. Okay, but essentially they share the same task. So the word dishonor then helps us interpret the word glory. So what does it mean to be the glory of man? Well, it means to be the honor of. It's bringing honor. Okay, the source of the woman's man, and therefore such an origin indicates a different role in the created order. And again, woman was created because of man in order to help him in his tasks. And therefore there should be a structure of honor going on. Just as man honors God because God created him, so because woman was created from man, woman honors man. And woman also honors God. So you have this hierarchy in this order of glory or order of honoring each other. Okay. Now, the role of men and women are not related to the fall, as some would argue, because again, they are part of the created order. Paul's going to argue from the creation here, not the fall. Redemption in Christ is not going to negate creation. Paul again uses this argument from the source in 11:8 to argue for the wearing of head coverings by women. So this seems to be a prolonged thing. Now, or a hitting a principle. Now, in verse 10, we have this idea of a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And again, this is going to point back to 8 and 9. So what's the structure? In verse 7, men ought not to wear head coverings. Verses 8 and 9 support this. Verse 10, therefore women ought to wear head coverings. So 7 and 10 are very much in parallel. Now, what about this idea of women having authority on her head? Well, in the Greek, women ought to have authority on her head. A symbol, sign, or veil, again, are not in the text. Just the word exousia, or authority. That's all it's there. But again, the structure in 7 and 10 are parallel. So the issue at stake here is a woman's proper role in a relationship to a man. Again, this is communication of an obligation, not freedom. And the idea of a symbol of authority is essentially an implied word from the context. So I do believe that that word should be there, even though the physical word's not there. The correct interpretation or the correct translation is symbol of authority. Again, the qualification in verses 11 and 12 best fit with the command to have women wear a head covering or a symbol of authority. So again, it's not strange to see exousia as a sign or symbol of authority here. And the standard lexicon, by the way, shows this is a viable possibility. So even if it's referring to an act of authority, it's referring to the man's, not the woman's act of authority. And because of the angels, what's that all about? Well, we don't really know. But they assist in worship and desire to see the order of creation maintained, so there could just be something to that there. Now, what about the qualification in verses 11 and 12? Let's go ahead and look at that one more time. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. So here's the cool thing about the qualification. This is to keep people from misunderstanding. Women and men stand in interdependence, dependence on each other in the Lord. Man is the source of woman, but all men ever since Adam have come into the world through women. Everything then comes from God. So there's a rejection of the notion that women are inferior or lesser human beings. So he's making sure people don't get confused here. Okay? And then finally, he concludes this argument for head coverings in verses 13 through 16. He's going to appeal essentially to the Corinthians' own judgment. the very nature of things is going to instruct them with respect to what's fitting and proper. Okay, the content of instruction of the nature is long hair is a disgrace to men, long hair is a glory to women. Okay, so again, nature, the natural instincts of right and wrong that God has planted in us, especially with respect to sexuality. You see this in Romans 1:26 through 27. They do things against their nature. There's a natural inclination to masculinity and femininity. And these instructions are binding, again, for all churches in the Greco-Roman world. And so this principle cannot be dismissed as cultural. So what are we seeing? That essentially what these verses teach is that there are to be boundaries respected between men and women in terms of their roles and relationships. That women should show in general a deference of authority to men. And this is a foundational principle. It's that, quote, the sexes, although equal, are also different. God has ordained that men have the responsibility to lead, while women have a complementary and supportive role. If women pray and prophesy in church, they should do so under the authority of male headship. End quote. So again, failure to wear these head coverings is really a rejection of the authority of male headship and leadership. It's a bigger deal than people think. Culturally, the link of not wearing head coverings is not communicating the same thing to rebellion in the modern day. So here's the issue. Do you have to wear head coverings today? No. Why? Because that's not what it's communicating today. Instead, dressing as a woman, showing proper deference with respect to men, dressing as a man, showing proper deference or proper leadership of women, is what we are required to do today. Again, anything that is rebelling against male headship is to be rejected as ultimately satanic. Anything that is abdicating leadership by the men should be rejected as satanic. We should dress in ways that don't confuse the sexes and act in ways that respect each other's positions as given by God in creation order. So engaging in rebellious behavior like this, again, is going to lead to the dissolution of the distinction between men and women. And it's one of the things we see today. What we see is where you have this confusion, this lack of male leadership, this lack of leading, you see it propagates into families, it propagates into churches, it propagates into youth groups, it propagates into leadership, it propagates everywhere, and it's destructive for the church. And so this is why Paul talks about head coverings, because if it breaks down at a certain level, if the authority of men break down to a certain level and men are rejected from position of leadership with regards to family, church family, home families, then we're going to have a fundamental breakdown of the family unit in general. And so this is one of the reasons why these verses are very, very important. So I want you guys to keep that in mind as we move then in 2 weeks to women should be silent in churches. What that means, it's not silent of all types. Again, Paul already said here, they're praying and prophesying in public in the services. What it's regarding actually is the judgment of prophecies. Women should not be sitting in judgment of prophecies. That's what I'm going to argue for next time in 2 weeks. So with that, thank you so much for joining us here tonight at Spirit of Truth Church. And I'll say this before we end. If you do have any questions or if you want to jump on a Zoom call, feel free and paste down there. If you would like to do a short Zoom call, I'd be more than happy to discuss this more. I'll wait here a moment to see. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody jump in. All right, so anyway, with that, thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Have a great night.